Hey everybody, happy Halloween! I'm your new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, Dave Sedia, and today we're going to be talking about uh, dispelling some myths about React. We'll be learning some spells to get rid of confusion, uh, also known as a AMA. So I got a bunch of questions from people, really good questions, and we're going to go through some questions about React and front-end development and stuff like that today. If you've got more questions, drop them in the chat. And I'll see how many I can get to. So yeah, today's going great. I already like 5 minutes before I hit go on this, the fuse for these lights blew. So I was like, oh gee, it's really dark in here. So that was fun. Got it fixed though. It came with a spare fuse. So all right. So first question I want to go over is this one from Eddie. He asks, what do you think about the future of React? And I think kind of the question within the question here is like, is React here to stay? Maybe how much longer is it here to stay? Should I still learn it? There's frameworks like Vue and Svelte out there. And you know, the front end world sort of has a history of changing rapidly. Not that many years ago, React was brand new, and like Angular was the big thing. And a few years before that, it was jQuery, right? So web development kind of moves fast, and so you wonder like, how long is this thing going to last? So I think it's interesting to look at some data for this. Let me share my screen here. So this site is npm trends, and you can put in a bunch of packages and it'll kind of graph out like how popular they are or how many downloads they have over, in this case, the last 2 years. So React is the green one here. You can see it started, well, I don't know, 2 years ago. It was already kind of winning, but it's trending, right? It's up and to the right here. I don't know what happened to the middle here. This is weird, but generally good, right? And I think Angular Core. So Angular Core is like Angular 2 plus. I guess they're like 8, right? That is also kind of trending in a good direction. Angular, the orange one, is Angular 1, and that's kind of flatlined, which sort of makes sense, I think. I think the interesting thing is that even though Angular 1 is like, not the cool thing anymore, people are like, everyone's using React, right? But there's still like a strong core of people who are, the downloads are holding steady, which means that there's probably a lot of companies that built their code base on Angular 1 and don't want to rewrite it. And I think even if React, I don't know, 20 years from now, is React going to be the hot framework? Probably not. But I do think that, growth like this is not going to go to zero quickly. It might fade eventually. I think it's got a long ways left to go, but even if it does, like, it's not gonna disappear. So actually, an interesting one to look at. If you look at let me click off. Well, I'll just add jQuery because this is interesting. jQuery is dead, right? And it's like, it's more widely used than all the other frameworks put together, pretty much, except React. So I think, this just kind of goes to show that like the sort of front end hype cycle, like the stuff you see on Twitter and Hacker News and stuff, it's cool, and like, yeah, maybe it's gaining popularity and stuff, but the tried and true stuff stays around for a while. I think React has reached that point where it's going to be here for quite a while to come. So let's go on to the next question. We've got, so I got a lot of questions actually along the lines of like, how do you implement user authentication in React? There were like 3 of these. Yeah, Steven, we have Angular 1, but we can't justify the cost to rewrite. And I think that's the case. Like, the business doesn't care that there's a new shiny framework out there that you'd rather use. Like, their current code works, and maybe it's kind of painful to work with, but it gets the job done and it makes the money. And I think that's kind of the way businesses look at it. Not a whole lot of, not all of them are going to rewrite in the latest hotness. So yeah, I think even as React, if it declines in the coming years, I think it's going to be still pretty widely used. So yeah, so back to this user authentication question. This is a common one. I think I got like 3 different versions of this that were like, where do I store the JWT token? How do I actually do authentication? And I think to answer this, I would say to sort of forget about React for a second and just imagine like you have a form. It's just an HTML form, right? You submit a username and password to a server. It sends you back a token. And now you need to send that token with every request from then on to keep it authenticated. And up till now, like this is not React stuff. This is just there's a form. You send a request and you get a token. But you've got to save that token somewhere. And so React is good at rendering things like forms. And you can write a function to run when the form is submitted that can do the server call. And then you can get that token back, right? And then after that, you've got to store it. And React is good at storing things too. You've got state. React has built-in state. It's had built-in state since day one. So you can store that token in state and then pass it along to whatever needs it. So just using state and props, you could put it in top level state, like maybe your app component, like the root one. Store the token there, have that manage the user stuff. It'll hold the token, it'll hold the current user object, and then pass it around. And you could either, pass it around with props. You can use context to make it a little bit easier. And then just pass it along to your API calls when you make them. So that another sort of variation or angle on this, I guess, was token expiration, and JWT tokens usually have like a timer or a timestamp when they're going to expire built into them, and so you can parse that with the library, and just set your own timer that matches that timer and delete the token when it expires. I think there's a bunch of different ways to do this. Ultimately, you have to save a token somewhere and replay it. And another thing you can do is put it in global, like a global API variable or something, so that your API functions can access it without having to pass it around. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Log the user in, keep the token around, pass it back up. Priya asks, yeah, so what are the correct approaches to use global variables in React that are particular to a component? So if a variable is particular to a component, I would not put it global, like put that in component state. If you have truly global stuff, like Redux is kind of built for that. It lives like above your whole React app and can pass things around. But if your API, like for this token thing, if your API functions aren't in a React component, like if they're just in a standalone file, you either need to pass the token into them every time, like sort of, I guess, dependency injection is a way to think of that, but passing an argument into every API call that's like, here's the token. Or you put that globally somewhere. And I've done that before. That works fine. I think it doesn't work so well if you're doing server-side rendering, so watch over that. But because you could end up with like sharing the same token across all of your user sessions or something, which is not what you want to do. But yeah, hope that helps. I got another question about jQuery plugins. It was, how do I make third-party jQuery plugins work along with React? And I think the short answer is that doesn't work very well. React likes to control its portion of the page. And it doesn't have to own the whole page, but it does. Most apps are made that way, where React is like the whole page. But you can have like, some small chunk of the page that is React. But whatever the case, like everything underneath that React tree, right? Like it is a root component and like a whole subtree. Everything under that subtree, React wants to control that, because it's got this virtual DOM mechanism, and it keeps this virtual DOM in sync with the real DOM. And if you change the real DOM from underneath it, which is what jQuery is going to do, React will get really confused and it'll break. So yeah, so don't do that. So if you want to, if you really need to mix them together, you can try to localize your jQuery stuff to like one component, make a wrapper component for it, and implement, if it's a class component, implement should component update and just return false so that React will render that thing once and then never again. And then that kind of carves out this little bit of DOM that you can control. And you can do your jQuery stuff in there. But I think that the better answer is don't do that. Like don't use jQuery with React. They don't mix very well. I think it'll be kind of painful trying to do that, because I think that this question comes from usually probably like I have a jQuery app, but I want to add React to it. Like it's mostly jQuery. It's just going to be really painful. So there's a lot of libraries out there for React now. You know, the stuff that jQuery was kind of known for, like good date pickers and select boxes and all that kind of fun stuff. There's a lot of things like that for React. So I would like go in search of those. If you Google like awesome React components, that kind of stuff, there's a whole bunch of GitHub repos out there that just have like categorized list of kinds of React components and like which ones are the best ones, and you can go with those and avoid the whole jQuery problem. So the next question I got was, can React interact with PHP code or PHP files? And yes, sort of. So React is really ultimately, like, think of React as HTML. Like once it's built, it's going to be an HTML file, like index.html and some JS. And you can serve those files with any web server or any backend. It doesn't have to be Node. It can be PHP, it can be Rails, Python, whatever. React app, all a React app needs is a DOM element to occupy. So it needs to be able to find something, usually by ID. But you know, however you can select a DOM element, as long as you can find a unique one and put your React app in it, you'll be all set. So if you have a PHP file, as long as you can render out a div that has like a specific ID that's not going to change, and you can tell your React app to render into that div, you should be all set. And you'll have to update your like React DOM.render call to match whatever that ID is. But that should take care of it. Yeah, React is pretty much server agnostic. Doesn't really care what you're using on the back end. Sunita is asking, what best projects to play with for Redux? Do you mean for like learning Redux, like what kinds of projects to build, or like examples that are already existing that you want to try to learn from? Or let me know. I'll move on to the next question for now. So actually, this next one's kind of about Redux too. It's what are your thoughts on Redux Observable versus Redux Saga? So I can only really speak to Redux Saga. I've only used Redux Saga. I thought it was okay. Kind of felt like more complexity than it was worth, though. I think Redux gets a bad rap for all the boilerplate. Like, oh, I want to add a new action. I've got to like create an actions file and make it, go update the reducer and go change my components and connect new components and write new map state to props functions and all this kind of stuff. Like, you have to touch a bunch of files whenever you want to make a change. And Saga is, to me, maybe we just did them badly, but it felt to me like Saga's added another step to that process. It was like, oh, now I have to write a Saga, and I have to make sure to start that Saga. So I have to go like find the run function and add this Saga to the bottom of it so it starts up. And it just, yeah, I think, I don't know. I think it can overcomplicate things. I think Saga was useful for more complex flows. I think maybe we misused it. Maybe we just use it for like every little thing, and I think it's not good for that. I think like Redux Thunk is like simple enough for most things. And the new Redux starter kit comes with Thunk built in, so you don't have to even install it. It's pretty cool. Yeah, Redux Saga, using Redux Saga in a React Native app, and it felt really convoluted. Yeah, I don't know. I think part of what draws people to Redux Saga is that it uh feels linear, like it feels synchronous because you can use async await and you're like waiting on things to like you dispatch an action and you can wait for it to happen and that kind of thing, and that can be useful, but if you're trying to like if that's the main reason you're using it, I think it'll be a little more painful up front to learn how like just get better at async stuff, but once you do, the async stuff will be a lot easier to write. um I think the other at least when I was using Saga, like one of the big benefits was that it's really easy to test. And what that seemed to mean in practice was that your tests were basically the exact same thing as your Saga code. Like you just write the Saga code and then go over to your test and like you have to rewrite the same code again. And that just felt just felt silly. Like you're testing the exact code that you just wrote. And if you get it wrong, then it doesn't. Then the test fails. And like, well, okay, but all I did was write the same code twice. So I don't know. That didn't seem all that valuable. Um, so Axios or Fetch to make HTTP calls. I think so. Fetch is nice because it's built in. You don't have to install anything, except for older browsers, I guess. You need a polyfill. But Axios's API is a lot nicer. Um, yeah, I I should usually lean towards Fetch if I'm doing tutorials or something because I don't want to introduce like, hey, install this thing, and now you have to use another library. But for my own projects, I usually use Axios because it's nicer to like write axios.post and not have to pass up that the big object of manual headers and stringify JSON yourself and all this kind of, I don't know. Fetch is not the cleanest API. Um, the other thing that I came from Angular 1 before I used React, and Angular 1 had this HTTP service built in that worked pretty much like Axios. And so I was used to that way of doing things where like if the server returned a non 200 response code, like a 4 whatever or 500 or something, the Axios call would throw. And so you could catch the server error and handle it. But Fetch doesn't do that. Fetch only throws errors when there's like a catastrophic like network error or something. And server errors are like okay-ish. Like they will go through the then handler and you've got to like do your own error handling. And anyway, I like Axios. Unless you want to write your own fetch handling code, error handling stuff. So for building new projects, so best projects to play with for Redux for building new projects. So I yesterday I did a live stream on React practice projects, and so you can check that one out. I think if you just look at my YouTube channel, you'll see it. If you go to my blog, click on all posts and look for practice projects, you'll find things there too. But some of those I think would be really good Redux projects. Like the bigger ones, anything that has like global sounding state, anything that fetches from a server would be good practice. You could save that globally, save it into Redux. You can get used to the kind of like dispatching actions to fetch data and handling like when they are loading and succeed and fail and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Let's see. So next question was, would understanding React implementation details, such as how Fiber is implemented, help write better React code? And I don't think so. I think that like I don't think knowing the internals of React is like important, really. I think React has a good it's a good abstraction, and like you don't have to worry about the internals a whole lot. I think like I think knowing those internals are not really going to help you write better React code day to day. But if it like bothers you to not know how the thing works, I encourage you to like go check out the React source code because it does do a lot of cool stuff. So I kind of like to know how things work. Like that was my first inclination with hooks. When hooks came out, I was like, how does it retain state between function calls? And I had to figure that out. So if that's you, then yeah, check out the internals. But I think if you don't really care about the internals, if you don't care how it works, I don't think you don't have to go and study up on like how Fiber does its stuff. It is a lot of the new like the concurrent mode, suspense stuff is built on Fiber and what that enables, but it's also not. I don't know. I think it's more useful in understanding edge cases. So, but day-to-day stuff is not super important. Views on Ionic React. I have no idea. I have not played with Ionic at all. Sorry. I saw that it came out. That's cool. But I haven't played with it at all. So another question was, if I wrote a website in React, what steps do I need to take in order to make it a native application? So the short answer is learn React Native. So all the concepts you know from React, like state and props and JSX and all that stuff, all that carries over to React Native. So React, I think the slogan for React Native at one point maybe still is learn once, write anywhere. So you can learn the concepts of React, and then now you can write web applications and you can write native ones. And I think that's true, but there's some changes in the actual code. So you couldn't just copy and paste a React app into React Native and have it work, because the elements change. So there's no on a native platform, there's no DOM, so you don't have tags like div and span and that kind of stuff. There's no CSS. So the elements change. There's like view instead of div, text instead of span. There's a bunch of different elements that pre-built ones that come with React Native that map to native controls, like scroll views and toolbars and tab bars and stuff like that. So it is definitely like its own other stuff to learn, but you can take the sort of like the mental models that work for React and carry them over to React Native. And if you wrote a website, like if you built your React app in a way that was easy to replace all the divs with Vue, then maybe you could write some sort of abstraction layer that would, like, on desktop use a div and on React Native use an actual Vue component. I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, check out React Native. Oh yeah, the CSS thing. So it also doesn't. So it doesn't have CSS, but it does have a styling system that works similar to Flexbox. So if you know Flexbox, you can carry that knowledge over. But it's like a CSS and JS style thing. So you're like writing objects that describe your styles. William asks, have I freelanced on the web? If so, how did I start? Was it easy to find clients? I haven't done really much freelancing at all. I've done a little bit of consulting with a past company I worked at, but no, I haven't gotten into finding clients and everything. And actually, I don't know much about that. I've done a little bit of research on it. I've thought about going down that path, but never really got into it too much. Yeah, don't know. I know Brandon Dunn has a site called Double Your Freelancing that has a lot of good advice for like getting started with freelancing and stuff. Check that out, because I don't know very much about it myself. Let's see, so more questions. Okay, this one. So I'm looking for a remote internship. Do you have any advice on how to prepare? This one, so I think just generally assuming it's going to be a React role, study up on React's core features to like make sure you understand Hooks, probably. I think they'll probably ask questions about hooks. Classes and life cycles, probably useful to know. This goes back to that thing about how like old code sticks around. If businesses have a bunch of code that uses classes, then they're probably not rewriting them all in hooks the day hooks came out. Um, so yeah, it's good to know kind of everything there. And I don't know, at least I've had a couple of interviews where people ask me like, what does this life cycle do? What does that life cycle do? And when does component did update run and that kind of stuff. So good to kind of review those, check out the React docs. Maybe write some little toy apps that like just log out something in every life cycle so you can figure out when they run and that kind of stuff. I think at a higher level, it's useful to know just how you would solve a bunch of like a variety of problems in React. And this, I would say, check out that the live stream from yesterday with the practice projects. And I'm not saying you have to like go and build all of them, although it's useful to have like portfolio pieces. But just think about if you sketched out an app on a piece of paper, like how would you break this down into React components? Where would the state live? Like which props would each component require? That kind of stuff. Because I think if you can get good at doing that, then the actual coding it up becomes kind of like, implementation details. It's just like, oh, okay, I know what I'm going to build. I'll just go and build it. It's really that thinking in React that's the core skill there. Yeah, thanks, Carlos. Yeah, Hogwarts stuff. Lots of Hogwarts stuff. Including this awesome robe that my wife made. So we've got a couple questions about if you need to handle state of a functional component internally. Maybe I missed the if you use class components. If you use class components, no need to use hooks at all. Yeah, I think if you're using class components, you don't have to use hooks. Hooks are definitely optional. Like if you like classes, you can stick with classes. Like I think React has been really good about backwards compatibility since like initial versions of it. I think there's this idea that like stuff in the front end world changes quickly, and I think to some extent that's true. But within React, React doesn't change that quickly, like in terms of breaking changes. There haven't been that many breaking changes. And I think actually, so when I started using React, we didn't have like JavaScript classes yet, and we use React.create class, and you can still write components that way. Like it's not built into the library anymore because they wanted to save space, but you can install. There's like an official, React create class package that will give you that function back, and you can still create components that way. It still works. So I really think, I think there's enough class component code out there that like it's gonna be around for a while. And yeah, keep using classes if you like them. Let's see. So Carlos asks about for deployment, which is more optimal, to have React and Node in separate ports or to use Webpack? I would say for deployment, you don't really want to have like a dev server serving your React app separately. So whether you're using Node or whatever, I think your primary web server, like your static asset server, like the thing that's serving the HTML and the JavaScript images, whatever, that should be serving React. You want to have it compiled. You want to have it like already built. If you're using Create React App or if you're using Create React App, you can like run npm run build yarn build, and it'll create those assets for you. Just like copy them to your server. The development server thing, like having the auto recompiling Webpack dev server thing, is really useful for development mode, but I don't ship that to production. So let's see, Carlos, another question. So is a good practice protect the routes with component auth? Oh, okay. Yeah, so protected routes. Is it a good practice to protect routes with a component like auth? And if the auth is true, return the children protected. or is it better to use hooks? So, yeah, that's a good question. I think, um, you really do it either way. So with the hooks, you'd be doing it at the component level, right? Like you'd be checking if you're authenticated and like rendering the component, or maybe null if you're not authenticated. Um, I think if you already have routing in place, you probably should do it at the route level, because it makes sense to authenticate at the route level usually. Um, but but not always. Probably like if you're rendering, thinking like maybe you have a nav bar and some sort of component that shows up only when you're logged in. Like maybe you'd want to check that in the component, um, or maybe you'd want to check it outside the component and not render the component. It's really up to you, I think. But I think yeah, that there's always that problem of like with once you get into authentication, you're if you're shipping the authenticated code, like the authenticated components to the client, um, then kind of like sneaky people could figure out what that does, which is okay as long as your server is protected. So uh, maybe I'll just take this as an opportunity to give you to make a PSA that you should always protect stuff on the server. Assume that the client um is bad and will try to hack your server stuff. Make sure you're protecting things server side. Don't rely on client side authentication to protect like actual sensitive data. Um, what's the best way to call web services in React? So yeah, so this is maybe a little back to that question about fetch versus Axios. You can use either one. If you're using GraphQL, then use some GraphQL library like Apollo or something. Um, yeah, I don't know. Pick your HTTP library of choice. I think if you don't really care, just use fetch. I guess fetch is easy-ish. Axios, whatever. I don't know. If you want to install one, use Axios. But anyway, once you pick that, depending on if you're using classes or hooks, you need to usually fetch data when the component mounts. And so for classes, you do that in like component did mount, and for hooks, you do it in a use effect. And just make sure to pass that second argument to use effect so you don't get the infinite loop when you're fetching data. Let's see. So this question, what are your thoughts on TypeScript and GraphQL for React? So I haven't used TypeScript with React much or at all, actually. I've used TypeScript a little bit with Node, and I've liked it. I think has its pluses and minuses. But a lot of people seem to like it a lot with React. I think it's helpful for bigger projects, especially. Or I guess in my case, like it's a project that I don't work on very often, so I'll go back to it every couple months or something and be like, what did this function do? And so having the types there is really helpful. And definitely for a larger team, like having the type system in place is useful. And you get the autocomplete and everything. It's nice. GraphQL is really cool too. Another thing I haven't played with very much, but it's exciting actually. And actually for the Pure React workshop that I'm putting together, I did an interview with Eve Porcello and Alex Banks, who do like GraphQL training full time, and got to chat with them a bit about like how to get into GraphQL and why it's cool. And I don't know, it was a cool conversation. That interview's in there. Yeah, fetch is easy, built in. Oh yeah, glad you liked the React Redux tutorial. That tutorial was huge. It took forever to write. All right, let's see. So, any other questions in the chat? No, I think we're out of chat questions. Oh, animations in React. Oh yeah, that's a good question. That's a hard question. I don't know. There are libraries for making animations declarative and easier, like React Spring. There's like Pop Motion. I feel like they've renamed this thing a few times. There was a thing called Pop Motion Pose, and there was like a React version of it. I feel like maybe it's Framer Pose now or something. Anyway, find some sort of library and use that. There was another really cool one too that I forget the name of now. React Transition or React something. It did React Morph. I think it's called React Morph. It takes you can give it like a component tree and another component tree and just tell it to flip, and it will like automatically animate elements from one position to another. It's really cool. I think it uses React Spring under the hood. So I think I guess to kind of wrap up, it feels like the subtext of a lot of these questions is like, how do I solve some specific problem in React, whether it's animations or authentication or whatever. And I think, routing, and I think these questions kind of come from like having a shaky foundation in some ways, like not being able to think in React, or to be able to solve problems like in like the React way. Thinking declaratively is definitely a learned skill. It took me a while for sure, like coming from like jQuery and then Angular and stuff, and thinking in terms of like imperatively, like do this, then do this, then do this, into the React way of like, I have some state and I'm going to render stuff based on that state. It's tricky. And you've got to build a bunch of stuff, I think, that small projects and stuff to kind of learn that intuition and run into all the little edge cases, like how do you do a modal dialogue in a stateful way. And there was another question. Another question that came in that I wanted to touch on was, so this is another sort of specific problem. Let me share the screen though. Cool. So I got this question about building this golf scorecard app in React, and so this is a code pen. This is using just using jQuery, but the question was like, how would I redo this in React, and how would I add features like when I click on one of these input boxes, I want the input to like grow bigger and like maybe kind of like zoom in a bit as I type in the value. And I want to highlight the thing if it's depending on its score. I don't know golf very well, so I forget what the terms are. But anyway, yeah, so like changing the color based on the value and like zooming in and out of the input and stuff. And I think this is one of those things where if you come at it from like, I have no idea how do I solve this in React, then it's going to be a struggle. But if you think of it in terms of breaking it down in terms of state, your states here are like the input has focus or the input does not have focus, right? That's one piece of state. The other piece of state is the value itself. So like maybe it's 4, maybe it's 17, whatever. So those are kind of like, I think the two, it must be less than or equal to 7. Look at that. You do some validation. So those are like kind of the two primary pieces of state I would see here. And so you can, if your component can keep track of those things, like am I focused and what's my value, you can do stuff based on that. So you can, add a CSS class that zooms in when it's focused, and take that class away when you click away. You could just use the CSS focus selector, actually, probably. And then for the value, you can apply a class when the value is larger than a certain number, remove that class when it's smaller than some other number. So that's like how you might approach thinking in terms of like statefully thinking about this problem. But it's a tricky skill to generalize, I think. Like it definitely takes some time to get used to how to solve problems in that stateful Reacty way. I think that the way to learn that, I think, is to kind of go back to basics a bit. Ignore third-party libraries, like put Redux and CSS and JS and stuff aside, and just focus on like pure React and just build apps with like props and state. Because if you can do it with props and state, you can do it with everything else. And everything can be boiled down to like, I will just pass this prop through every level of the component, until it gets where it needs to go. That will work. It might be a little annoying to write, but it will get the job done. And if you can solve it that way, you can definitely like add some shortcuts. Like, okay, now I'll add context to make it easier, add Redux or whatever. I think once you have that, you've got a more solid foundation in like how to think and React, and you can layer things on top of that foundation. So a couple more questions. Using async await with this.setState. I don't know. So setState itself is async. So you can add a second argument to setState, and it'll run that argument whenever you're done, whenever it's finished updating. But you can't really like await a set state to happen. I would say like put your set state inside or after. I think you can put an async around like component did update or something, or component did mount. So you can use await, like await a API call or something, and then call set state. Do that. And thoughts on Redux versus MobX state tree. I haven't used MobX state tree, but I've heard great things. I want to look into it. I think it's when I first heard about it, it seemed like it would be too magical or something, like stuff changing behind the scenes, and I thought I wouldn't like that. But I've gone through this a couple times where I've thought something was gonna be too magical or too, I don't know, just weird. Like I felt this way with hooks. And then after I tried it, I realized like, oh, actually, this is pretty great. There's a difference, I think, there's like a disconnect between reading about a thing and like forming opinions about it that way versus like actually writing the code. And anyway, no, I haven't tried MobX state tree though, and I'll probably try to check it out at some point. So I want to kind of wrap up. I mentioned that I am putting the finishing touches on this new, improved, expanded React, Pure React workshop. So it's going to be pretty awesome. I think you're going to like it. It's coming out very soon, and you'll hear more, hopefully very soon. Don't miss the live stream tomorrow. And happy Halloween, everyone. See ya.